likely recognize this. It's from a Scientific American article from 2018, and many of us use this when we're teaching undergraduate courses that are focus on human variation and the complexity of biological sex. And as the title suggests, the idea of two sexes is overly simplistic. This article clearly outlines for a popular audience how scientists recognize this complexity beyond the binary. And it points to ongoing societal discussions about binary sex and biological complexity. We've also had years of headline news to help make these abstract arguments real and meaningful. So for example, renewed debate about the boundaries of human sex, is that better? All right. And implications for the regulation of testosterone levels and bodies of women and girls in sports. And many people are now more aware of these issues as they expand rather than resolve. So now, in addition to debates about intersex bodies in Olympic sports, we're seeing polarizing policies about transgender athletes hinging on definitions of who is recognized and allowed to compete as a woman. In the US, there are now statewide bans on trans athletes competing in youth or high school sports, and more broadly, these really reflect greater societal challenges and sociopolitical issues to understand diversity about sex, gender identity, what it means to be a man or a woman, or even non-binary, and who gets to decide that, whether that's in sports or in daily life. So toward pushing forward a conversation in our discipline about this, here's a roadmap for the rest of my talk today. I'm going to start by laying out the problem, so focusing in on issues of binary categorization and the ways that we might think about examining human diversity in a different way. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might modify our frameworks to include gender-sex entanglement. And here I'm going to draw on the concept of biological normalcy to show how these binary constructs act as social determinants of health. I'm going to wrap up by sharing a few examples from my research focused on transgender health that hopefully further elaborate why these issues matter. I'm going to start by highlighting some issues with binary sex categorization in humans to set up how we might get at diversity in a different way. So as anthropologists, we are arguably the experts for studying human variation and diversity. We obviously excel at collecting data to understand variance and are well poised to contribute to these critical conversations that are focused on gender and sex. Thanks to our work, we already know so much about inter- and intra-group hormonal variation when assessed in behavioral and cultural contexts. So sticking with the examples of testosterone, here I'm showing you T variation in response to parenting role on the left, so examples from social endocrinology, and on the right, variation in different populations around the world. Binary sex and gender categories are clearly central to how we currently organize our thinking about humans. And these categories structure our research questions, our hypotheses, and our interpretations of the data that we collect. The images here showing, for example, you see what we've talked a lot about just in the past few days, so growth and development, BMI, sleep, as well as so-called sex hormones and binary group comparisons. So now this often makes good sense, especially when it aligns with clear hypotheses that warrant these analyses. But part of my argument today is that we also tend to rely on these binary categories as proxies for other things, so other mechanisms, or we just default to these group comparisons without hypotheses driving those. So instead, we might analyze the specific mechanisms more directly. Reliance on the categories themselves can also limit some of the questions that we ask as well as the data that we collect. So hormones are a key example here, where we don't often see estradiol collected among men, and we similarly don't often see testosterone collected as frequently among women. This is also important in terms of the presentation of our results. So our findings can also sometimes have unintended consequences. So these include reinforcing fixation on biologically essentialist interpretations of male and female difference, and also confusions about fixed biologies and types, so rather than biologies that are dynamic and responsive in certain contexts. Overall, this pushes us to consider what we are trying to get at when we structure our research this way, and how could we make this more explicit or effective in our work. So this is obviously not a simple question. As these images indicate, there's a lot of history here. This is a huge issue in health science and in feminist science studies. When should we conduct sex-based comparisons? These examples are pointing to the problem of erasure of women in health research on the left. So doctors must dig into gender difference to improve women's health care. And then on the right, a contrasting view, so focusing on differences between the sexes is leading medical researchers astray. This particularly the image on the right with the image of the Ambien bottle, this points to a problem of attributing differences in medication clearance that impact dosage and also risk to gender sex. And this is a really powerful example because, in fact, BMI was key in that, not the gender or sex or gender identities of the individuals. That has obviously clear implications for dosage guidelines. So this isn't a case for never conducting group-level comparisons. It's for being explicit about what work the categories are expected to do. So since sex is really reflective of a cluster of biological traits, if we can get closer to measuring and analyzing those hypothesized biological mechanisms at play along with gender-related, so ideally experiential data, then that would be more ideal. To tackle some more easy-to-remedy issues, so beyond making hypotheses and methods more explicit, we can also address some missed opportunities with data collection. So often we assume people are cisgender, so that is people whose identities align with their assigned sex at birth, and that people are heterosexual. This is particularly true when we're looking at people who are gender normative, so where gender expression matches binary expectations, as well as in places where gender and sexual diversity is violently discouraged or even criminalized. In reality, we have no idea who our study participants are much of the time because we don't ask. Data about gender and gender identity, for example, for the most part aren't collected outside of research that is actually focused on gender minority populations, so trans and gender diverse people. So the examples here on this slide, for instance, they're showing surveys asking only about sex, so the top one here. And this presumably reflects sex assigned at birth. This may or may not actually align with someone's gender identity or lived gender. The second example shows conflation of gender and sex. So when asking about gender, the options provided are, again, for sex. And the option to select man, woman, transgender, non-binary, or other options for gender are not provided, so there's a lack of clarity about what these terms even mean. And what this really represents is an opportunity for enhanced inclusive data collection. So here's one example, and this is from Canadian health researchers whose work does focus on transgender health in North America. This is what's referred to as the two-part question, because the first two questions enable recognition of people who are not cisgender by asking about assigned sex at birth and gender identity. Some issues with wording exist even here, so man and male and woman and female arguably should be separated for clarity here, and also a select all that apply option should be added, among other things. The third question, though, can also be useful for adding into this. It considers what someone's lived experience is and their gender expression, and this can also differ from one's gender identity. The terms and wording would, of course, need to be continuously updated, informed by local communities, and need to reflect the linguistic and cultural context that we're working in. Building on this in our analyses and drawing on recommendations such as these good practice guidelines for researching sex and gender in human health, I'm just going to go through these 5 points. So for the first, we can be more explicit in what we're trying to learn what we're trying to learn in terms and fully defining our outcomes and our independent measures. We can specify more clearly the potential mechanisms instead of or in addition to looking at differences between binary groups. For the third, more often than not, we are developing and often testing these mechanisms anyway, so a lot of this just has to do more with how we're framing our analyses and how we're presenting our results. We also already usually collect and analyze social and biosocial data to varying degrees in our work to test alternative hypotheses. So the recommendations here align with our disciplinary aims of capturing human experience from a holistic perspective. And 5 is to test biological and social mechanisms together. We tend to already do this as well, and it speaks to a biocultural approach. Some of these recommendations are included in a paper published with another biocultural anthropologist many people know here, Heather Shattuck-Heidhorn. This was published last year in the American Journal of Human Biology, and in this we really tried to unpack many of the concepts that I'm talking through right now, building on understanding of gender-sex entanglement, challenging the way that binary categories are used, detailing some examples of the problematic reliance on the use of group means to represent typical biologies, and documenting the ways binary norms can reinforce stigma and inequality regarding gender, sex, gender identity, and sexuality. So given these critical issues, how might we modify our frameworks to include gender-sex entanglement, and how can the concept of biological normalcy clarify how binary constructs act as social determinants of health? One way is to reconsider how we're engaging the categories of gender and sex themselves. So initially, the separation of gender and sex represented a challenge to biological essentialism upon which so much sexism is based. Gender came to represent that which is lived, is socially constructed in the sense that it's interactive, and it affects how we all operate in society. It's also recognized increasingly as fluid, especially when it comes to identities and expression. Sex in this framework reflects the biological, and as we know, is dynamic and responsive. It's also lived, but is in fact assigned at birth, and it's based largely on external genitalia. But increasingly, scholars, including myself, are suggesting the use of gender-sex as a combined term and a way to conceptualize the realities of diversity and entanglement. Scholars in feminist science studies, neuroscience, and psychology have frankly been leading the way in this work. As the titles of these papers indicate, the combined construction helps us consider how biologies embody sociocultural experiences and how our sociocultural experiences are responsive to and interact with our biologies. So in practice, we as anthropologists are ideally methodologically trained as well as theoretically sophisticated to apply these ideas and move them forward. In addition to expanding our ways of conceptualizing entanglement and testing these relationships, the model of biological normalcy developed and elaborated by Andrea Wiley is useful for understanding how binary categories of gender and sex act as social determinants of health. So for those that are unfamiliar, the model is a circular one. It allows us to see relationships between statistical norms and normative views. So how cultural norms influence how we do science, and then how the statistical distributions and biological traits that we document develop and study or leverage to reinforce and inform those same cultural norms. So coming back to the example of testosterone, this exposes how we don't have the data to make these decisions. This notion of what is too much testosterone emerges in fact out of data collected and analyzed within a really Western and clinical model that's used to establish the norm in the first place. So this issue also exposes issues of racism in interpreting population variation that we could and should include in our discussions. So this is a dynamic relationship, one that also makes clear, and this part is really key, how scientific contributions can be culturally transformative. And this came up a bit in our discussion on ethics. So my lens into this work is through my research, which focuses primarily on embodied stress and inequality among gender and sexual minority people. And my work in trans health in particular makes startlingly clear the negative effects of the gender binary for human health and well-being, as I'll share in a moment. But I want to make sure to make this point clearly as well, which is that a rigid binary system with rigid binary categories are social determinants of health for all people, not just gender and sexual minority people. Cisgender and gender normative people are up against the same limitations and face the same risks in terms of stigma and harm and embodied stress as trans and gender non-binary people do. Data about the experiences and lives of trans and gender diverse people shows a clear link, however, between these rigid norms, stigma, and health. These are always heartbreaking stats to share, but dozens of surveys have found an alarmingly high rate of suicide at 41% in the United States of trans people in their lifetime, and this is compared to only 4.6% of the general population. And in large part, this is driven by experience of high rates of violence, harassment, as well as a lack of access to health care and health resources, as well as increasingly high rates of homicide, particularly targeting trans people of color. An example that highlights how interpersonal discrimination and stigma become institutionalized is reflected in aims to criminalize the use of gender-specific public bathrooms that don't correspond with one's assigned sex at birth. So shrouded in propaganda, these bills use scare tactics, suggesting that all trans people are cisgender men dressed in women's clothing in order to do harm to women and children. In reality, trans people are the victims, not the perpetrators of violence, and campaigns like the We Just Have to Pee campaign shown on the right shows how ludicrous these bills really are, as they would result in transgender men being required to use the women's restroom in accordance with a female sex designation at birth. These types of debates and policies clearly reflect some of the confusion and harm that a strict binary construct brings to the forefront. And again, as anthropologists, we've got the tools necessary to really understand these harmful effects that these kinds of stigma can have. In my work, like others, I combine survey, interview, and ethnographic methods from our discipline in combination with measures of psychosocial stress and stress embodiment in order to understand stress effects, allostatic load levels, and health risks. And to do this, I draw on methods of data collection familiar to all of us probably in this room, shown here. So these are developed and refined by those in our field, including Josh Snodgrass and others. So the minimally invasive biomarker collection that enables data to be collected outside of clinical settings. It enables the examination of embodied stress and stigma, including dried blood spots, blood pressure monitoring, saliva and hair sampling, and then point-of-care devices. Findings in my work, and here I'm showing diurnal rhythms from salivary cortisol samples from 65 transgender men in the US. These show significantly heightened waking cortisol levels and cortisol waking response among transgender study participants who are experiencing social stressors that reflect exposure to stigma and rigid gender binary-based norms compared to people who are not experiencing those stressors, so also trans people. So the top left is focusing on stress effects of a transitioning identity, so juggling a shift in a gender identity or gender presentation that doesn't align with fixed binary norms and expectations. And to the right of that is showing stress about coming out as transgender. The bottom left is showing heightened cortisol among those who report experiencing stress about using gender-specific public bathrooms. And the bottom right is showing no significant difference in cortisol levels between when looking at general perceived stress. And this really shows the poignancy of some of these specific types of binary gender-based stressors. And here I'm going to just reiterate that in these highly politicized contexts, our work is critically important, and we're some of the best suited to do this work and to make these contributions that are so vitally necessary. I want to just wrap up to say that though the latter part of my talk has focused on stigma and the issue of the binary as a social determinant of health, my hope is that by outlining some of the issues, including over-reliance on binary gender-sex categories in our design and our analyses, the need to engage with gender-sex entanglement, and the lack of detailed and inclusive data collection, that I've persuaded you to see this as part of a powerful lens that could be brought to bear in all human biology research, not just among gender and sexual minority people, or studies that are focused on gender sexual minority people. Thank you, and I also just want to bring up one more slide, which is just to share some suggestions for further reading. I know a lot of these topical areas, this is a really hot topic, it's a new topic, and there's a lot of dynamic debate and writing. I was unable to sleep at 4 a.m. this morning and on Twitter and saw 2 more articles that I could share in addition to this that are really grappling around the question of sex as a biological variable in health research, and so there's just more coming out all the time, but these are some of the papers I've drawn on in developing this work and that I recommend if you want to do some further reading. Thank you.